June 2023. In the corner of a police storage facility in Avon and Somerset, an evidence technician opened a cardboard box that hadn't been touched in more than half a century. Inside were the belongings of a woman who died before man walked on the moon. Folded neatly was a blue skirt, preserved in plastic. Beneath it, a police report, fingerprints, and one crucial photograph, a black and white image of a partial handprint on a dusty pane of glass. The box had sat there for decades. No one had expected it to matter again, but it did. That same week, a cold case review team retested the skirt using modern forensic methods that didn't exist in the 1960s. A DNA profile was successfully extracted, full, intact, and ready to be run through the national database. When the results came back, there was no uncertainty. It was a match. The man it belonged to was 91 years old. He was living quietly in a bungalow in Ipswich. No history in that town of serious crime, no known reason for anyone to suspect what he had done. Until that moment, he thought it was over, and for 58 years, he had kept a secret that he never expected would surface again. But on a quiet morning in November, officers knocked on his front door.
I'm here today because I'm arresting you
Yeah,
on suspicion of the rape and murder
yeah,
of Louisa Dunn, which happened in Bristol in June 1967.
yeah,
The reason I'm arresting you
yeah.
is because the police have investigative material that indicates you are responsible for that rape and murder of
Yeah.
Mrs. Dunn,
Yeah.
which happened at Britannia Road in eastern Bristol, June 1967.
But this wasn't the first time police had arrested Ryland Headley, and it wasn't the first time he had gone to prison, because Louisa Dunn's murder wasn't an isolated crime. It was part of a disturbing pattern of sexual violence that stretched years beyond that single summer in 1967. A hidden trail of attacks and a series of rapes of no one had ever connected until now. But before we begin, if you find this video interesting, please give it a like at the end and tell me what you think about the case. It really helps the channel. And don't forget to subscribe for more. Thank you. Louisa Jane Dunn had lived through 2 world wars, the loss of 2 husbands, and most of the 20th century before her life ended in a way no one could have imagined. Born Louisa Jarrett in 1892 in Barton Regis, Gloucestershire, she came from a generation that endured silently, carried burdens privately, and rarely made the headlines. But within her quiet life was a thread of civic pride. In 1915, she married Edwin Teddy Parker, a respected city councillor and dedicated Labour Party member. The two of them weren't just husband and wife, they were a political pair in a city that still clung tightly to working-class identity. There were rumors she might one day become mayoress, standing beside Teddy as a public figure. She was sharp, warm, and well-liked. But in 1945, those plans were taken from her. Teddy died that year, leaving Louisa a widow. And though she continued to be active in the community for some time, something in her shifted. 7 years later, in 1952, she remarried. Her second husband, John Dunn, was a night watchman, a quieter man, more suited to the solitude Louisa had grown accustomed to. They lived a modest life, tucked away in a red brick home on Britannia Road in eastern Bristol. But tragedy returned again. In 1961, Louisa became a widow for the second time, and this time she withdrew more deeply. Neighbors saw her less and less. She stopped attending community meetings, and by the mid-60s, she had grown increasingly reclusive. A quiet figure behind net curtains, polite but distant. She lived alone at 58 Britannia Road, a 2-story terraced house, a lace curtain over the sitting room window, and a mailbox that rarely saw much more than pension paperwork. Louisa was 75. She had lived a full life, even if the last years had been quieter, and no one suspected that, in just days, her name would resurface, not as a former councillor's wife, but as the victim in one of Bristol's most horrifying crimes. June 1967, the final week of Louisa Dunn's life passed with little disruption. She had been seen at the local grocer's on Monday, carrying a small handbag and wearing her usual overcoat. She nodded at Mrs. Cartwright from next door, but didn't linger for conversation. By Wednesday, no one had seen her. The milk bottles remained untouched outside the door. Curtains stayed drawn through the morning. It was unusual, but not enough to panic anyone. Louisa was known for keeping to herself, but then came the night of June 27th. Around 11:15 p.m., Several neighbors later recalled hearing a noise, a short, muffled scream followed by what sounded like crying or strained breathing. It was brief, lasting no more than 5 seconds. Some assumed it was a fox, others stayed silent, uncertain, unsure. But by Thursday morning, something felt wrong. Mrs. Cartwright knocked at the door, waited, and tried the handle. When there was no answer, she walked around the back and looked through the rear window. That's when she saw her, lying on the floor of the living room, her legs awkwardly positioned, her skirt pulled up. Louisa wasn't moving, and it was clear she hadn't been for some time. The police arrived just after 9 a.m. on June 28, 1967. Inside the living room, the scene was deeply unsettling. Louisa was lying face up on the carpet. Her skirt had been pushed up toward her waist, and there were signs of a struggle, a broken teacup, scattered magazines, and bruising along her neck and chest. A local GP was called to the scene and confirmed what many had feared. She had been dead for several hours. The cause was soon determined: strangulation and asphyxiation. But there was more. Signs of sexual assault was present. It wasn't just a murder. It was a brutal, invasive attack against a woman who had spent her final years alone and vulnerable. Neighborhood interviews began immediately. The 1967 statements later read in court painted a picture of a close-knit street frozen by fear. One neighbor said, "I thought it was a cat. You hear sounds all the time, but there was something strange about that scream." Another recalled the sound of something falling, a crash, maybe furniture or a body. And yet, no one had seen anything. The attacker had entered and exited without being seen. No witnesses, no obvious motive, and no clear suspect. In the days that followed, panic spread quickly. The press called it a tragedy in Easton, and the city speculated wildly. Was it a prowler? A targeted attack? Had someone followed Louisa home? Police launched one of the largest fingerprint and palm print drives in Bristol's history. Over 19,000 prints were collected. Every man who lived or worked near Britannia Road was asked to provide one. Officers combed through known sex offenders, recent parolees, even vagrants who might have passed through. But every print came back negative. The partial palm print found at the back window, the attacker's likely point of entry, didn't match anyone. And after months of pressure and no progress, the case slowly slipped from headlines. Louisa was buried. Her daughters, Edna and Iris, moved forward as best they could. The police filed it away under unsolved. And in time, everyone stopped asking what happened on Britannia Road. But the evidence hadn't disappeared. It was just waiting. But at the center of it all was a man no one saw coming. Ryland Headley was not a name anyone in Bristol remembered in connection to the 1967 killing. In fact, most didn't remember him at all. But in June of that year, he had been living just miles away from Britannia Road, close enough to walk, close enough to know the area, yet far enough from suspicion that his name never made it onto the list of 19,000 men fingerprinted and questioned during the investigation. He had arrived in the UK from the West Indies in 1952, part of the wave of post-war Caribbean migration. He was in his early 20s then, young, quiet, and looking for work. He settled first in Bristol, where he eventually married and started a family. By 1958, he had 3 children and a machinist job on the railway. To neighbors, he appeared to be just another immigrant trying to build a life. But beneath the routine and the respectability was something much darker. Shortly after Louisa Dunn's murder, Ryland quietly relocated. He didn't leave Bristol entirely. Not right away. Instead, he moved just outside the perimeter of the police's original search area. It was a subtle shift, not enough to raise flags, but just enough to avoid scrutiny. There was no grand disappearance, no dramatic escape, just one man slipping through the cracks, while investigators combed every inch of Easton, unaware that their killer had already stepped quietly beyond their reach. By the early 1970s, he was living in Ipswich, and while Louisa's family continued to mourn in silence and the cold case files gathered dust, Ryland Headley began to leave behind more victims. In 1977, 10 years after Louisa's death, police were called to 2 separate scenes in Ipswich. 2 elderly women, one in her 70s and the other in her 80s, had been attacked inside their homes. Both had been alone. Both had been raped. Both attacks mirrored what had happened to Louisa in chilling detail. There were no cameras and no witnesses, but this time the women survived, and they talked. One victim recalled how he broke in through the window, how he held her down, and how calm he was the entire time. The other described his voice, the weight of him, and the way he moved. Fast, deliberate, controlled. There were no doubts in their minds that it wasn't a random attack. It was someone who had done this before. Ryland Headley was arrested and charged, the evidence was strong, and he was convicted. The court sentenced him to life in prison, but it didn't last. During an appeal, a doctor testified that Ryland's behavior stemmed from sexual frustration caused by his ambitious and demanding wife. It was a bizarre defense, but it worked. The sentence was reduced to 7 years, and after serving barely 2, he was released. By then, Louisa's name had all but faded from public memory. Her daughters had grown older, the house on Britannia Road had changed owners, and the file on her murder remained closed, unsolved, untouched, and nearly forgotten. And while Louisa's case remained unsolved, her killer was already behind bars and then quietly released. For nearly 6 decades, the file had sat untouched, a list of names long since forgotten. A photo of a woman who had once hoped to become mayoress of Bristol, now reduced to a cold case number buried in the archives of Avon and Somerset Police. But in June 2023, that changed. Operation Beetle was launched by the force's cold case unit. It wasn't a high-profile initiative. There were no flashing headlines or public appeals, just a quiet decision by 3 officers, Detective Constable Joe Smith, Sergeant Andrew Perry, and retired Detective Barry Frayling, to re-examine what time had almost erased. They began the way most cold cases do, in the records room. Dozens of boxes were pulled from deep storage, some crumbling at the corners, others barely legible. Among the old exhibits was a blue skirt sealed in a plastic evidence bag. It had belonged to Louisa Dunn, the same skirt she was wearing on the day she was murdered. And in 1967, it had been examined for fingerprints. But DNA testing didn't exist then, so it had never been properly analyzed. Now, 56 years later, science has caught up. The skirt was carefully tested in a modern forensic lab. Swabs were taken, analyzed, and uploaded to the UK's National DNA database. And within days, it returned a match. Not just a partial profile, not just a distant relative, a full match. The name that came back was Ryland Headley. His DNA had entered the system in 2012 during an unrelated legal process, but now that long-forgotten entry has linked him to one of Britain's oldest unsolved murders. However, the team didn't stop at the DNA. There was still the matter of the partial handprint found in 1967, a strange, incomplete impression left on the inside of the window at the back of Louisa's house. At the time, it had led nowhere, but forensic science had evolved. The print was reanalyzed, not by one, but by 4 separate fingerprint experts, each working independently. Each examined the palm ridge patterns between the wrist and the base of the little finger, and all 4 reached the same conclusion: it was him. So on a quiet morning in November 2024, Avon and Somerset Police drove to Ipswich. Headley was 91 years old, living alone, frail but lucid. Officers knocked on his door. He opened it slowly, unaware that history was about to catch up with him. Body cam footage showed him standing calmly in the doorway, and when they informed him he was being arrested for the rape and murder of Louisa Dunn, he didn't react with shock or panic.
I'm here today because I'm arresting you
Yeah.
on suspicion of the rape and murder
Yeah.
of Louisa Dunn, which happened in Bristol in June 1967.
Yeah.
The reason I'm arresting you
Yeah.
is because the police have investigative material that indicates you are responsible for that rape and murder of Mrs. Dunn,
Yeah.
which happened at Britannia Road in eastern Bristol, June 1967.
But what was even more shocking was his replies and reaction during the interrogation.
Was there any conversation between you and Louisa?
No comment.
There were a number of people nearby who heard a scream in the early hours of the morning.
No comment.
Did Louisa scream?
No comment.
What made her scream?
No comment.
At a point, he even laughed dismissively.
You look a bit confused by that. Do you want to ask me something?
He said, no, and you often climbed up 2 windows or this and that, people's house. No comment. A bit knowing discretion, you know.
Ryland Headley's wife died 10 years ago. He has 3 children and 1 stepchild. Much of his working life was spent on the railways.
So Louisa was found, as I said, lying on the floor in that same room, having been raped. She also had a scarf on her neck and a stocking. I think the scarf was underneath her neck, round the back, and the stocking over the top.
No.
Okay. Can you tell me how those items got there?
No comment.
Did you use those items to strangle Louisa?
No comment.
It was June 2025, nearly 58 years after Louisa Dunn had been buried, and the air inside Courtroom 1 at Bristol Crown Court felt heavy with history. At the prosecution table sat Charlotte Ream, deliberate and composed, tasked with presenting evidence in one of the oldest cold cases ever brought to trial in Britain. Across from her sat Ryland Headley, thin, gray, and 92 years old. He wore a blazer that hung off his shoulders, and for most of the proceedings he stared straight ahead. Behind him was a glass wall separating him from the gallery, and beyond that, the quiet buzz of reporters and onlookers, some too young to remember Louisa's name, others who had lived with the silence since 1967. Presiding was Justice Derek Sweeting, who reminded the jury that age was not a defense, and while many of the original witnesses were gone, the evidence had not faded. If anything, it had finally started to speak. The prosecution began with the forensic breakthrough. A crime scene skirt, sealed and stored since the late 60s, had yielded modern DNA. And that DNA had matched Ryland Headley's with such precision that the odds of it belonging to anyone else were said to be 1 billion to 1. Then came the partial palm print, left on the inside window of Louisa's back room. 4 fingerprint analysts had reviewed it. All had reached the same conclusion. It was his. The print matched in key areas: ridge flow, curvature, and landmark points, all consistent with entry through the rear window, believed to be the point of access. The courtroom was silent as each slide appeared on the projection screen. The jurors leaned forward. Even Headley seemed to glance up only briefly before returning to his stillness. But the evidence didn't stop at science. The court had allowed hearsay statements from 1967 under special legal provisions. Several of Louisa's neighbors, long since passed, had given signed testimonies the night she died. One described hearing a scream, short and muffled. Another remembered a woman's voice crying out, followed by silence. None of them knew what they were hearing at the time. But now, in court, those voices became pieces of the timeline. And then came the testimony of Dr. Norman Taylor, the very same doctor who had pronounced Louisa dead nearly 6 decades earlier. He took the stand with trembling hands but a clear memory. He described the scene in vivid detail: the position of the body, the ligature marks around the neck, the pulled-up skirt, and the bruising that had once been dismissed as non-specific trauma. His testimony added weight, but what followed gave it force. The Crown Prosecution Service had successfully argued for the inclusion of what's called bad character evidence, a rare move only granted when prior crimes show clear, probative value in establishing guilt. The jury was told about 1977, when Ryland Headley had broken into the homes of 2 elderly women in Ipswich and raped them. One was 72, the other was 84, and the details of the assaults were graphic, and their statements, recorded decades earlier, were read aloud in full. Charlotte Ream paused after each, giving the courtroom space to absorb what they'd just heard. The defense, for their part, maintained that the evidence was flawed by time, that memory fades, that palm prints can be misread, that the DNA may have been cross-contaminated after all these years. Headley himself never took the stand. He sat motionless, day after day, denying everything through silence. But the prosecution had built a bridge across decades, and by the time the closing arguments ended, there was a feeling in the courtroom that history was finally catching up. It took 9 hours and 53 minutes. By the time the jury returned to their seats on the afternoon of June 30th, 2025, the courtroom was still, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Ryland Headley, now 92, sat with his arms folded, his eyes forward. He showed no expression as the 4 persons stood to read the verdict. Guilty of rape, unanimous. Guilty of murder, by a majority of 10 to 2. There was no outburst and no reaction at all from the defendant. But at the back of the court, seated quietly beside the cold case team, Mary Dainton, Louisa's granddaughter, lowered her head and wept. The next morning, Headley was brought back for sentencing. The press had already begun to report on what was now the oldest solved murder case in British history, but the headlines hadn't fully captured the weight of what was about to be said. Justice Derek Sweeting addressed the defendant slowly, every word deliberate. He told Headley that this was a crime of cruelty and domination, that Louisa Dunn had been alone, vulnerable, and targeted. He described how Headley had not only violated her home, but her dignity, and that the decades of silence did not erase the violence of what he had done. Then came the sentence, life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 20 years. At 92 years old, that meant one thing. You will never be released, the judge said. You will die in prison. And that's exactly what Louisa's family had waited nearly 6 decades to hear. After court adjourned, Mary Dainton gave a short statement outside. Cameras surrounded her, but her voice didn't shake.
Since Ryland Headley was charged, I've struggled emotionally in ways I did not anticipate. And it falls to me to speak for people who are no longer here. It saddens me deeply that all the people who knew and loved Louisa are not here to see that justice is done.
Ryland Headley has left a legacy of misery and pain through his offending, and likely thought he'd got away with Louisa's murder until officers knocked on his door last November. Crimes of this magnitude should never go unpunished, and we remain relentless in ensuring we do everything we can to advance other unsolved murder cases in the Avon and Somerset area.
Louisa Dunn had once been a name buried in a box. Now she had a story and justice. But for police in Suffolk and Norfolk, this wasn't closure. It was a beginning.
Headley, who has a shocking and abhorrent history of violent sexual attacks on elderly women, brutally attacked Louisa in her own home, where she should have been safe.
This was, the judge told the jury here at Bristol Crown Court, a highly unusual case, not just because of the time that's elapsed since the crimes, but also the age of the defendant. Headley sat throughout the verdict with his fingers close to his ears, trying to hear what was being said, outwardly showing no emotion.
Following Headley's conviction, both forces reopened a number of cold cases, each one chillingly similar. Women over 70 attacked in their homes. Forgotten names, silent files, unanswered questions. Among them, Edna Harvey, murdered in 1984, Doris Shelley, killed in 1993, and Karen Hales, another 1993 case. Each one unsolved, each one possible. Because Headley had moved quietly, he crossed counties, changed addresses, and vanished into time. And now investigators were asking a far more chilling question. What if Louisa wasn't his first? And what if she wasn't his last?
I think it's appalling. The poor woman. It must have been absolutely terrifying. And the reality of a rape, I don't like thinking about. I don't think anybody does.
I think this investigation shows that you should never give up. Yes, it's from 1967, but actually, at the time, we reinstigated it in 2024. That was 57 years ago. There was a chance that a suspect could still be alive, and as it turned out, he was.
And in the end, this case wasn't about a courtroom or a prison sentence. It is about Louisa Jane Dunn, a woman who once dreamed of becoming Bristol's mayoress, who buried 2 husbands, who spent her final years behind drawn curtains, and who, for too long, was remembered only as a victim. Now her name has weight, her story has been told, and her voice, silent for 58 years, has finally been heard. Louisa's case didn't just reopen an investigation, it redefined what justice can mean, even after a lifetime, and it proved something else too, that no one, no matter how long they run, is ever truly gone from the reach of truth. So what do you think about this case? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.